Hello, thank you for the invitation. Me and my colleague Maria Ikoniadou are going to present the paper entitled Imagining Homeland in Two Magazines for Refugee Children in the Cold War. In this paper, we discuss some of the ways in which children's cultural identities were expected to be formed and performed in the 1950s and 1960s. Our aim is to contribute to the decentering of scholarship on Cold War by moving the focus away from Western Europe, the United States, and Soviet discourses. For this reason, we examined two magazines for refugee children, the Eaglet, published in Budapest between 1949 and 1953, and the children's Pyrsos, published in Dresden between 1961 and 1968. These Greek language periodicals were produced by political refugees who, after the end of the Greek Civil War, sought refuge to the former democratic republics of Central and Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union. The two magazines constitute a case study on the ways Cold War cultural politics formed the lives and imaginings of displaced children in Europe in the 1950s and the 1960s. In what follows, we analyze the ways each magazine invited its young readers to construct a notion of national and internationalist cultural belonging.
For some historical context now, the readership of both magazines were children that were either born or had arrived at a very young age as political refugees in the Eastern Bloc countries. The Greek political refugees had to flee during or in the aftermath of the Civil War, which lasted from 1946 to 1949, in order to avoid persecution following the defeat of the left-wing Democratic Army of Greece against the Greek National Army. The Civil War lasted officially, as I said, from 46 to 49. However, in most of areas in Greece, it had already begun in the 1940s during the resistance period. Although the exact number of the exiled refugees varies depending on the sources, approximately 17,520 of those who fled were children and teenagers. The Greek political refugees were granted temporary political asylum, and then temporary with the quotation marks, as that was the hope at the time. And the political asylum in the hosted states, while a string of Greek state issued special resolution that stripped them of the citizenship, in effect depriving them of the prospect of repatriation officially until 1982. The impermanence of this temporary exile led Greek refugee children and youth to constantly oscillate between loyalty to the host state and to the country of origin. In this context, publishing provided an avenue for children and adults alike to express, reflect, and share their traumas of war and exile, deal with their insecurities, and crucially negotiate their identities in the socialist states while imagining their future of repatriation to Greece.
And now we come to the first part of this paper, which talks about the first case, the case of Eaglets. And I quote, "Come with me today. We won't be going to the snowy mountains, neither to the woods nor to the sea. We will be treading in the streets of December 1944 in Athens, where the bullets of the revolution are whistling. If you did not see Athens on December the 3rd, you have no idea about the morale of our people. Only the Parisian citizen of 1789, the Red Guard of the inflamed Metropolis of 1917, and the Spanish in siege in Madrid would be able to understand." End of quote. Issued soon after the end of the Greek Civil War, the Eaglets prioritized the formulation and consolidation of a socialist identity for their intended readership. At a crucial political juncture, with the leftists rendered as the enemies of the homeland, there was an identity void left to be filled according to the worldview of Sovietism. The two fundamental constituents of their in-process identity were the notion of topos and internationalism, gradually built through imaginary and real trips across time and space. The readers of the magazine, the so-called Eaglets, the counterparts of the pioneer groups in the socialist states, are constructed in the magazine as a collectivity in the body of the Greek left, but also in the body of the wider internationalist socialist family. As such, they are expected to transform Greece into a socialist state, either through peaceful or, if necessary, through revolutionary means. As the magazine writes, and I quote, may we be liberated by next year, freedom to the enslaved homeland, end of quote. The aim was to gain qualifications such as educational, political, and cultural, while in the socialist host countries, thus prepared to reconstruct Greece on the unquestionably, and this within quotation marks, successful socialist model. Hence, the children were constantly reminded of the role they could play in reclaiming Greece as a socialist country. Indeed, the Eaglets aimed towards the deterritorialization of the identity of their readership. To this end, the rejection of contemporary Greece was formulated so as to serve the imagined reconstruction of the country as a homeland that would be included in the socialist states. Greece, the territory where the Greek refugees had been displaced from, is constructed in the magazine as the topos of historical leftist struggles against the Nazis, and again within quotation marks, the monarch fascist and English corruption. It is also depicted as a topos of martyrdom of leftists in the contemporary present. References to the notorious internment camps of the leftists on the Aegean Islands are a constant reminder of the oppression by the so-called colonizers and their local collaborators. The magazine writes, and I quote, "Our brothers suffer in the American Dachau and the Bastilles of monarch faces," end of quote. The representation of Greece as a state wherein the children's peers suffer the consequences of the Anglo-American colonization, again Anglo-American within quotation marks, namely starvation, hardships, illiteracy, exploitation, and political indoctrination, further contributes towards the deterritorialization of their identity. The refugee children's living conditions in the host countries are presented in the magazine as a benchmark against which the welfare of the Greek children is measured, only to be found lacking in health, education, and happiness. A regular column entitled "Children in Enslaved Greece" reinforces the severance of bonds with the homeland as it paints a bleak picture for the children living in Greece, some of them imprisoned with their mothers or alone in reform camps. Another column, entitled "From Our Children's Lives in the Democratic Republics," emphasizes the refugee children's socialist education. In the words of the leader of the Greek Communist Party, the little eaglets were, and I quote, "the warriors of the army which is going to liberate Greece," end of quote, while he further urged them to become revolutionary fighters, truly internationalists, to eradicate chauvinism and nationalist divisions so as to become real communists. Indeed, the figures of the Greek Communist Party leader, Nikos Zachariadis, and you can see that on your left-hand side picture, and his Soviet counterparts, Joseph Stalin and Lenin, are ubiquitous in the Eaglets as evidence of the real socialist man, which the young readers can aspire to become. Thus, by giving prominence to another topos, most notably to the Soviet Union, a constant attempt was made to deterritorialize their identities, but with a new referent assigned to the symbol of topos. In the magazine Eaglets, topos as a cultural aspect is an amalgam of Soviet and Greek culture. Still, Greek culture is not completely denounced. Rather, specific elements are carefully extracted from across various eras and genres to support the magazine's narrative. For example, from the corpus of the Greek canonical literature, preference is given to traditional folk songs, especially those associated with the 1821 Greek Revolution against the Ottoman Empire. The magazine primarily publishes Greek leftist authors or authors whose work lends to leftist readings, and lastly, it extensively features Soviet biographical extracts, for example, by Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov, namely Lenin, Pavlik Morozov, Alexei Grigorievich Stakhanov, and Joseph Stalin, or classic Soviet literature, as Nikolai Ostrovsky's How the Steel Was Tempered, or Alexander Fadeyev's The Young Guard. Internationalism was also one of the central tenets the Eaglets presented intensely to their readership. Internationalism in this magazine equates forging strong ideological bonds not only with the Central and Eastern European socialist states, but also with other far-flung socialist countries such as China and Korea. Hence, internationalism in the magazine denotes a children's community that transcends corporeal and material borders to only include peoples living in socialist regimes or fighting against colonization. For instance, Korea with and this within quotation marks, the national hero, Kim Il-sung fighting against the Japanese is a case in point. The magazine writes that, and I quote, over there in Asia, people began fighting. In Mao Zedong's country, in Vietnam, in Korea, a red flame has been lit that casts its light on the slaves and it will never go out. End of quote. This idea of the global left is further reinforced with articles on the material and intellectual accomplishments of the pioneer groups or on newly established organizations such as the World Federation of the Democratic Youth or the World Peace Council and their congresses. The anti-colonial struggle in South and Eastern Asia is likened in the magazine to the 1821 Greek Revolution. The magazine states, and I quote, valiant warriors, Chinese and Mongols, Indians and Koreans, the yellow and black, all uprise and demand freedom, end of quote. In the same vein, the magazine touches upon racial discrimination in the United States and the suppression and confinement of Black people. Thus, class awareness is closely related to internationalism. A basic principle of internationalism was the promotion of world peace. Many articles are devoted to the World Peace Council organized at the initiative of the Soviet Union to foster world peace, while the United States is presented as a capitalist warmongering country at a time when the use of the atomic bomb was already a reality. As the magazine writes, and I quote, people's welfare is only accomplished with peace. We fight for peace because we want to secure the people's happiness. If the American imperialists prepare for war, we will not oblige, end of quote. On the cover of the January 1951, peace doves that carry, and let me show the previous, no. I'm sorry. On the cover of the January 1951, peace doves that carry banners that read peace, national sovereignty, people's republic, and general amnesty travel towards a map of Greece. On yet another cover, children from various ethnic backgrounds in distinct national attire hold a banner that reads peace. The Eaglets make an attempt to forge an international identity for their readers. International citizenship rests on two constituent ideas, socialist education and promotion of world peace as an answer to the imperialist expansionist policies pursued by the United States. The journal calls its reader to join the socialist international family and a indisputable leader, the Soviet Union, towards a new world order.
Children's Torch, 1961, 1968. And I quote, it's so nice to embark on a journey, especially in the summer when school is out. Come now, children, let's set off on an unusual journey aboard a ship with our fantasy for its sails and a speed equal to the spaceship that carried the first cosmonaut, Yuri Gagarin. The year is 1961, and the extract is published on the 4th issue of Children's Torch magazine, as I showed you here on the cover. Children's Torch, or Children's Pyrsos, that translates as Children's Torch, and I will refer to it like that for the remaining of my paper, was an 8-page pull-out supplement to the illustrated magazine Pyrsos. So there was a main magazine, and that was the children's supplement. Pyrsos was published between 1961 and 1968 in East Germany. The full-color Greek language magazine was published on good quality matte paper stock and was distributed alongside the main magazine to individual subscribers and organizations across the socialist states where the refugees resided. But it was also, and that's quite unusual for the Greek refugees publication, was also distributed to individuals and organizations of Greek economic migrants in the West. That includes most of the Western Europe, as well as Canada and Australia, pretty much everywhere apart from the United States. The magazine's distribution across both sides of the Cold War does not only differentiate it from other Greek refugee publications, but also discloses its editorial strategy and political aims, ultimately to construct a collective national cultural subjectivity for a diverse readership of Greek emigres in the 1960s. Still, by the time the first issue was released in 1961, the youth who had arrived in the socialist state as children, as we discussed earlier, or they were born there, had a faint or no recollection of Greece. So to return to the Children's Torch fourth issue in 1961, the journey that it describes is indeed unusual, since it takes them across time and space. Initially, the children described in the article visit the Aegean Sea on a sort of island hopping aboard a colorfully illustrated ferry boat that carries them across a calm sea. You can see that in the PowerPoint. The text complements the illustration describing the bright, warm sunshine, the smooth, salty air, and the dolphins who dance around the boat as if to welcome them. The narrator traces the Aegean's name to ancient Greek mythology before moving to the glorious history of the Greek War of Independence in 1821, also embellished with references to Victor Hugo. In a short time, the imaginary passengers, and with them the magazine's child readers, are presented with proud moments of Greece's national cultural history. The imaginary journey continues to the next spread, as you can see here, where the mood darkens, also evident in the different style of the illustration. This time, the viewpoint of the reader is from the sea, as if slowly approaching a quintessential Aegean port. The colors are no longer bright or playful, but rather a combination of dark blues and black tints, whilst the yellow, the depiction of the sunlight and the warmth, the Greek sunshine, if you like, and that enveloped the previous page, is in the spread far away from the sea. Most interestingly, a pale yellow tinted circle that's in the middle of the left-hand page makes a feature out of a close-up photograph of waves. So there's a photograph within an illustration that, itself a very interesting aesthetic element, which unfortunately I don't have the time to go much further into. So rather than an illustration, as is the rest of the spread, as if to highlight the vigor and the strength of the sea. The sober mood is reflected in the text and the visit to one of the country's exile islands. Also the place where the text is informing us that one of the children's uncle is held as a political prisoner. In one of the brief stops, the children visit the island of Mytilene to find out that it is one of the biggest producers of olive oil in the country. Yet, as one of the children is quick to point out, here, and that's a quote, if you haven't got a job, you haven't got money, and consequently no olive oil, end of quote. The carefully chosen adverb here, referring to the Greek economic condition in the 1960s, implies a comparison to a there in the democratic republics in the Soviet Union, and hence a nod to differences between capitalism and socialism. Still, I should highlight this an allusion rather than being articulated in the text of the magazine. The magazine's didactic discourse, rooted in a class struggle, is clearly evident in the description of the island's hardworking inhabitants, and particularly the fishermen, all of whom are being kept poor under challenging working conditions, whilst many are forced to emigrate in order to find work. So here's another allusion that it speaks to the economic migrants. All the while, as the article highlights, Greek ship owners are amongst the wealthiest in the world. The notion of tradition and a fleeting reference to the island of Naxos as the home country of Manolis Glezos, who became the symbol of the resistance because he held down the swastika flag from the Acropolis during the country's Nazi occupation in the 1940s, are encountered in the journey of the children in this article of the magazine. But also throughout children's Pyrsos is Manolis Glezos and the 1940s is a theme that the magazine revisits again and again. The journey in this article ends when the ferry boat approaches the main Greek port of Piraeus, where the children's grandparents await them, as the text reassures them, and I quote, "We will return, then the journey will be real," Across its 3 beautiful illustrated pages, the magazine constructs a complex notion of Greece as the homeland, which, on the one hand, it is a desirable destination with its warm weather, its idyllic landscapes, its mythology and history that dates to antiquity, as well as the place where the refugees' families await for their return, and also the dolphins. At the same time, it is a country where class determines access to goods. The economic conditions force inhabitants to migrate, and the beautiful Aegean islands are also landscapes of exile for political prisoners. Here, the magazine, The Children's Torch, refers to the Aegean landscape as a site of exile, particularly since the end of the Greek civil war in 1949, and a place of exile that, particularly for leftists, that lasted until the end of the military dictatorship in 1973. It is important to note that during this time, the consecutive authoritarian Greek governments organized the ruling ideological discourse and practice around the notion of the undesirables, whom they set out to rehabilitate and re-educate by force and torture in prisons and exile islands. In the nationalist imaginary, the Greek landscape was constructed and performed as a dream of unifying identities for people of common origins, language, religion, habits, and customs, both in past and in the present. For the official ideology of the Greek state, this dream was irreconcilable with communism and socialism. Hence, during these years, hundreds of thousands of political subjects were deported, tortured around the Aegean exile islands in prisons, where they had to either sign a loyalty certificate or they died. At the same time, this Aegean landscape in the children's magazine stands for the homeland. As Vassiliki also mentions, it symbolizes the national destiny, and unity. The Greek topos in the children's magazine signifies what the Greek literature scholar Artemis Leondis argues is the, and I quote, spiritual and intellectual potential of a people both fiercely grounded in local communities and perennially scattered across the world. Yet that nation as a dream was conceived as iconographic in nature and topographic in character. As the term indicates, imagery is inherent in the construction and projection of these sentiments. So here, and it is a case study of the children's magazine, and that's why I kind of chose to delve into the analysis of these particular pages. It's very typical of the magazine as a whole, but the journey that I described is made out of a complex dialectic that is also expressed through similar aesthetics. The brightly colored ferry boat against a bright yellow and blue illustration, followed by a darker sailing boat on the next spread, where the mood changes as the Aegean is both a place of beauty and a place of pain. In addition, the use of generic landscapes attempted to simulate past experiences, but also offered a sense of contemporaneity for Pyrsos' readers and the children who read the supplement, the Children's Torch magazine. Since these landscapes were still there in the 1960s in the contemporaneous Greece, and they would be the place of repatriation, the desirable repatriation, irrevocable parts of the country's geography. As such, their value for the magazine's readers in the socialist states, as well as the economic migrants in the West, was also associated with a nostalgia for the past and the desire to return to them in the future. Altogether, in light of the Greek left's history of suppression and exclusion from the country's national body, Children's Torch invites its young readers to engage with the complex dialectic of the desirable repatriation and the challenges faced ahead. Joy and pain, despair and hope, sunshine and darkness are presented on the same plane in the magazine. On the one hand, the depiction or the magazine's depictions construct the desire for the refugees' repatriation, while at the same time prepares the child readers to play an active role in the country's development in the future. The revolutionary spirit of the 1950s, as discussed in relation to the Eaglet magazine mentioned by Vassiliki, or discussed and analyzed by Vassiliki earlier, makes its appearance on the front cover of the Children's Torch later in 1961, as is pictured here. The illustration depicts 3 armed children that it could be argued that don't look Greek, but rather Asian, alluding to the contemporary struggles, or the contemporaneous rather struggles in Vietnam. Yet their army forage camps are made out of the magazine's regular columns for readers' letters. The text refers to the Greek children's heroic acts in the 1940s during the resistance periods against the Nazi occupation of Greece. And that's the next spread, which is actually referring to the Eaglets, the group of Eaglets in the 1940s that also Vassiliki was discussing earlier. I don't have time to go into the analysis here, but as I have written elsewhere, in the 1960s, the Greek left did not only declare its solidarities with international liberation struggles, but also identified with the so-called Third Worldist revolutionary anti-imperialism. In this sense, it projected its efforts for the democratization of Greece on the same plane and against the same enemies, namely US imperialism. As seen on this cover here, and despite the 1960s discourse of peaceful coexistence, children are given agency and a voice to speak up and speak out metonymically through the voice of the children in other nations, in the struggles of Vietnam, in this instance, and through the voices of the forerunners in the 1940s. And I'm going to show you this slide as the last slide of another struggles in Africa, or liberation struggles at the time. And I'm going to leave Vassiliki to conclude.
Thank you, Mary. I'm going to wrap up this paper. Drawing on the readers of Eaglets and children's Pyrsos, the paper employed specific images of Greece to argue that, albeit different in their claims and imaginings, its magazine aimed to deterritorialize Cold War borders and redeterritorialize the children refugees' notions of national cultural belonging. We compared the notion of belonging and internationalism as key feature of the refugee children's cultural identities, as these were formed and performed in exile and in relation to their repatriation in the future. We traced a major ideological shift in the idea of belonging as portrayed in the magazines. While in the Eaglets, belonging was mostly perceived in ideological terms, focusing on the Soviet Union as the motherland, in children's Pyrsos, Greece as a material speciality was reclaimed through both visual and narrative representations of the Aegean landscape. Yet, the idea of internationalism taken up in Eaglets was further enforced and reinforced in the discourse of Pyrsos, thus traced as a continuity which served the project of repatriation in peaceful terms. Gone was the revolutionary spirit of the Eaglets. Thank you so much for attending.